All right, welcome everybody. We are back with Dave McCarricker, the CEO, founder, king of Theory Underground. He was just at a platypus panel the other weekend. He was on a panel with Doug Lane and Bill Ayers. He was there to talk about the post-class fractured mass, which is an idea he's been talking about for quite a few months now. And he didn't really get a chance to lay it out fully, his whole thesis here, and have it really sit and be debated at the panel. And I'd like to hear more about it. And I'm sure the audience would like to hear more about it and see how it differs from the general Marxist or the general left view of class and where we are. And the potato thesis, because that was an interesting part of your talk.
Yeah, I thought I'd do something special for the occasion. And what I really love about the Platypus Affiliated Society, beyond its organizational genius, because I think Chris, Catrone, and Leonard Spencer are sort of organizational geniuses, right? I mean, that was proved by the event. I was able to see firsthand that the whole thing was pulled off more or less without a hitch, without them having to micromanage anything. In fact, I don't think they even really were overseeing it, except for maybe through some direct messages with some people. But they weren't there. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it was just the whole thing was student run, and to get, students are not easy to train up or organize, and they're quickly replaced because there's a quick rollover with students, which is their main demographic there. So the fact that they had students from all over the world, or at least the country in Europe, who were able to organize that thing, it was just like, wow, that's a real testament to the work that they've put in to this organization over the last 15 years. But what I really love about platypus is the image of the platypus. Uh, I'm imagining this platypus is in some kind of a cage, and there's Frederick Engels like looking at it, just like what, like just mind blown because he thought the diamat made it so that no, this platypus wouldn't be real. Now I might be getting that wrong. That's the way I have said it before, but I actually think it might have been his older conception of evolution before he developed dialectical materialism. So I'm a little iffy on the details, but whenever I think of the Platypus Affiliated Society, I think about people who are trying to be scientific about social change and who realize that the categories we use to understand the world uh, can become rigid and fail to actually work with the subject matter. And insofar as it works with the subject matter, it can cover things over and make you go, no, platypuses aren't possible, right? Because that was Engels' position. He
Yeah.
was like, no, I'm a hard-nosed scientist. The platypus is not the way of nature. That would not be possible. He thought it was a hoax.
Yeah. And then he saw it in real life and was like, okay, shit, I'm wrong. I need to rethink things.
Exactly. And so to have an entire organization kind of built around that moment, it's a real, I mean, it's a perfect sort of header for people from various viewpoints to organize under when they all at least share the basic idea of wanting large scale structural change.
Okay, well,
So
actually, why don't I start on that word? So, I mean, to anyone on the left, any socialist, Marxist, when they read you, they're reading, okay, this guy is a leftist who doesn't want to say the word socialism, right? Because you use the term uh, uh, large scale structural change. So maybe just start with why that is not socialism or why it's different. What does it include that socialism might not?
yeah, well, I think the word socialism tends to imply a lot of things. Sorry about my cough. I don't know what's going on with that. It only started in the last like minute, but when I think of socialism, I think of I'm not going to do the whole thing where I say gulags and breadlines. I'm going to think of how difficult it is to actually have conversations with other people. That's first. But then I'm also going to think about how it frames things, usually for most people, in a way that implies free markets versus centralized control. And then,
Mhm.
of course, people will think of ideas of central control based off of our current reality or of some narrative that they've received from history. And there's nothing magical about centralized control that will just make that work, whether or not it is centralized under the ownership or management of the working class or the proletariat or representatives of either. And so I to me it closes things too much to use these words, and at the same time, part of what it closes out of the picture might include that there's something important to learn from, for instance, Ludwig van Mises or something like that, where it's like I think what we need, and this is my position as an educationist as opposed to a socialist. My position is we need spaces in which we realize we really can learn from every viewpoint and tendency, and that's not just viewpoints and tendencies that agree on socialism or viewpoints and tendencies that agree on anti-capitalism, or that necessarily are left, right? That we can learn a lot from people who are left, from people who are right, from people who are religious, from people who are irreligious. And so for me, it forecloses the possibilities of a kind of pluralism that I think um, is at least important for educational spaces. So, I'm thinking of education in a way that is obviously going to get juxtaposed here to the kind of education that a Marxist cadre does.
Yep.
Because a Marxist cadre does education, but it's a very like, well, they agree on so many things before they even get in the room. And I'm talking about, well, there's a different kind of educational space. And then there's this whole argument or like question, depends on the person, that will come up about, well, is it what I'm doing pre-political? Is it anti-political? Is it social as opposed to political? Is it part of civil society as a part as a, this is why most of the platypus people who walked up to me afterwards, they instantly wanted to focus in on the question of the party. And it's kind of like the next hour I was talking to like seven people about the party instead of what I wanted to talk about. And I was basically saying I don't think it even makes sense to talk about the party, much less socialism, without seriously tarrying with the fact that the situation is so different than what we thought it was, and that we shouldn't suppose that we understand it without a serious period of
Mm.
suspending our presuppositions and working through the subject matter again. And that doesn't just mean Marxist texts or the kinds of texts that are on the platypus reading schedule, which I think are all very important, but kinds of, yeah, it tends to bracket out a lot of the stuff that we do at Theory Underground. A lot of the, like I say, uh, French fried Germans, right? The 1970s Parisian theorists who are all in their own ways talking about various things that the Marxists around them weren't taking seriously enough or really tarrying with. But that's why I get called New Left, even though I'm a big critic of the New Left, and I was really excited to be there and to disagree with Bill Ayers. And as Benjamin Studebaker said in our conversation we just had the other day with Doug, we at least seem to be in agreement when we're disagreeing with Bill Ayers. So,
Well, then that brings me to, at least superficially, Platypus and Doug Lane agree on, which the rest of the left, especially the Marxist left, seem to disagree on. And so, the like my old organization, the IMT, now the RCP, and all the other Marxist revolutionary organizations will tell you that the working class is bigger than ever. We just need to organize them. Right moment needs to emerge so that a party that's laying around can take up the cause and help direct them in the right direction to radical conclusions rather than reformist conclusions. Now, Platypus would say, he would agree with you that that's wrong. And they would say that we're kind of in a pre political moment because there is no civil society, there is no working class as such. It needs to be reconstituted. There are workers, but the class doesn't exist. They kind of agree that it's fractured. So how do you differ?
I don't want to come off as disrespectful, but I'm gonna first be crass and then walk it back because I think on the internet sometimes you kind of have to be. To me, it kind of sounds like imagine early Christians, are like the fantasy for current day Christians. And the
Mhm.
current day Christians say the church is gone. We have to bring back the church. And so to do that, we actually have to get people to realize they're in the situation that they were in back in Rome or something like that. And, and then they wanted to rebuild the material, political, economic conditions so as to get the church back to where it was. Right? Like that's just an analogy
Hmm.
that I'm using for how it sounds to those of us who are less committed to the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat here in the 21st century, right?
Hmm.
Because the dictatorship of the proletariat, or something more like bottom up, general strike, syndicalist kind of approach, what have you. Both of those approaches, whether top down or bottom up, however you want to put it, from ahead or from behind, they are assuming that it is, well, I don't want to say that they're assuming that the proletariat is real. The proletariat is real in a sort of sense, but they're assuming that it is getting welded together in this way um, that Lenin talks about, or they're assuming that we have to put back the conditions that could then weld together that proletariat. So I think that there's like the early Marxists, like the new young kind of person getting into Marxism, who's going to go, it's a dictatorship of the proletariat, let's go for it, or let's try to get the working class to organize and we'll have a general strike. But then they realize at some point, oh, the consciousness is not there. And for whatever reasons, maybe they blame it, like Ashley Frowley and Douglas Lane, they blame it on petty bourgeois identity politics. And then they say, well, we have to do something about that so that we can get back to kind of where we were
Well, it's also that there are no more
at the
like civil
end of the
social
nineteenth century.
institutions for workers that are kind of holding them all together, and that the rebuilding that part before the political part is what's necessary.
Right. So those institutions that we're talking about, things like working class schools and libraries and societies that were sort of extra civic or outside of the institutionalized civil society, because these were people who did not have legal representation. They were literally excluded for hundreds of years, right? They didn't have rights, right? That, those are political, material, and economic conditions that made it so that moms in the working class were as radicalized as dads, because they were like, oh, my kids are literally shut out of society. We have to build the infrastructure here, right? It's kind of similar to when you think of like the civil rights movement and black liberation, right? A lot of the rhetoric we hear from BLM people today is a rhetoric that made sense when they were legally excluded, right? That made it so that black normies were like, oh, we're legally excluded, we're not represented. But at the point that black normies are like, oh, I'm at home in the world and I'm represented by the Democrats, right? That that sort of rhetoric has lost its function, right? Except for in the minds of a handful of people who are probably historians or just really like history. And so I think the analogy still stands here with the proletariat. And so I want to read just a couple of things I think that I would have loved to get to on the panel. And so I say at one point, I say, by the time the proletariat was gutted of its advanced workers and then spread out far and wide across the globe, far from the centers of commerce and urban life, the practicality had vanished, the practicality of considering it the revolutionary subject, except for in the minds of those bookish professional revolutionaries for whom the old categories and libidinal commitments remained. Remember that in State and Revolution, Lenin says, while the bourgeoisie break up and disintegrate the peasantry and all the petty bourgeois groups, they weld together, unite, and organize the proletariat. And that was
Right.
obviously true in the time of Marx. It was questionable in the time of Lenin, and it's beyond dispute that it's no longer true today. And so what we have with Platypus is people saying, well, can we build the civic institutions that could weld it together? Or do we have to jump ahead of the civil institutions and create a party that could then, through its force, uh, do that welding? And so it's this question of order between party and civil society. Can the party create the civil society? Or does the civil society have to create the conditions for the party? And I'm
I think
saying
their
both
answer is the second one. because that's what
What's
the
that?
campaign for a socialist party is doing. They're saying this isn't we're not building the party now. We're doing the groundwork stuff, the pre-political stuff in order to get to that position.
Yeah, and there's this big question for me about how how much of a so with platypus, it's a non-sectarian, very non-dogmatic educational space. And obviously they bring together all kinds of people. But what are they teaching the students behind the scenes, right? Are they teaching them that they actually that this line is the true line,
No.
and it's a line that necessarily pipelines into the campaign for a socialist party? You say no. I kind of assume not as well. So I assume that there's healthy disagreement within Platypus about the priority of those two things. But
Yeah, they pushed like Doug had on what's her name who like is one of the leaders of Platypus today, and she's a millennial, and she was pushing back on Doug on saying no, actually we need to keep Platypus and the campaign basically as separate as we can. Like we're not going to promote you at all. Like there may be some overlap, but like she was trying to really emphasize that Platypus isn't in the business of funneling people into that.
that it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I assume we should trust that. But I think I the way I think of it for now is that Chris Chris is pretty sure. He spent 15 years thinking about this, and now he's pretty sure, and so he wants to devote his efforts towards that campaign for a Socialist Party. I would say, obviously,
But from
that's a good.
without.
It's a good operating assumption to have. Even, you know what I mean? Because obviously the party's not possible right now. So it is the one thing that you can do is to organize civil society.
He's saying, we should be liberals right now, basically. Get bourgeois liberal civil society back on track. Forget about the political socialist part for now. Let's go be liberals. Go organize tenants.
That was what shocked us the most when we actually met him in 2023, the first time. We were having dinner with him. It was Anne, Nance, and myself. We were on tour. We'd just done an event there at SAIC, which is the art school that Catron teaches at. And yeah, we were having dinner, and he basically said that like the anarchists are closer to correct than the Marxists because they're doing that civil society organizing with the ideas of mutual aid and whatnot. The difference between them and him is that, he sees this as a means towards an end, whereas in a lot of cases they see it as the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can respect that, but I don't think that just because civil society existed in such and such a way that allowed for the party to rise or make sense at one point in history, that therefore that would be the solution in our current situation. I'm open to that potentially being the case, but I think that before 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 getting ahead of ourselves, we need to really tarry with the post-class fractured mass, the structural stultification of time energy, the simultaneity and asynchronicity of the medium, the constant succession of presences, now this, now this, now this, the functional illiteracy, the libidinal consumerism, the hyper niche identifications. They're all part of all of the things that I just said, as well as gerrymandering the Finlichite. And I said the medium, but I really want to hone in on that. We're not just talking about kids on their phones these days. We're not just talking about people with TikTok brains. We're not just talking about people with the inability to follow a train of thought, which, by the way, an inability to follow a train of thought um, is an indicator of not just a lack of class consciousness or capability of acquiring some kind of a class consciousness, but actually it exposes the limitations of that subject's consciousness itself, full stop. Because I really like Samuel Loncar's been talking about this recently. He says, your attention span is the measure of your consciousness, right? So if you've got a 20-second, 30-second, 50-second attention span, and you can't follow multiple threads that someone is weaving, and then you get really excited and instantly want to derail the conversation with every little thing that pops into your head, instead of being able to take that thing and say, maybe I'll use that to intervene at the right moment, and then practicing prudence and discernment while following all those threads. If you can't do that, um, that says something about the actual measure of your consciousness. And then I'll say, it's not just you though. And obviously I'm doing the general you, not you, Eamon, but this general you, which is to say, all of us, we're functionally illiterate, structurally stultified, and there's been a genocide of voice. But that genocide of voice means a genocide of the ability to understand ourselves or communicate with other people in any sort of a meaningful way.
And you think in the 1800s, the early 1900s, this was a fundamentally different situation, even though, like, let's say, illiteracy was far higher back then. And yet they were still managed to do, organize people, organize illiterates, organize peasants, get people involved radically who didn't have the like today. I agree. Today, our baseline literacy rate like is low, but everybody can read. Whereas back in the day, if you could read, it was very high. It was very likely that your literacy was, several degrees higher than the average person today. But there was very few of them. So in a
Yeah,
way,
this
does
is
that
why
not
it's
eat?
functional literacy, because functional literacy is actually worse in some ways than real illiteracy. Like real illiteracy is what I had before the age of 12, right? I didn't know how to read. I just literally couldn't. I felt ashamed about that, and I knew I couldn't read. So I knew that I was lacking. But functional literacy is like you can read a stop sign and you can read the fine print on something, but you don't have the ability to follow it through in terms of attention span, and you also don't have the ability to change perspectives on it, to take up different positions to it, to interpret it from different viewpoints. You're not practiced in thinking about the different genres of uh, literature, and the different kinds of requirements for evaluating or interpreting different kinds of literature. And that's because you've been taught nothing really more than a kind of writing that is supposed to either make teachers or bosses happy.
And just so
So
everybody knows, like, if you're in this position at all, like, it literally hurts the brain to go to try to, like, move up those steps. If you're way down at the bottom and you can't think of things from different perspectives, and people are trying to get you there, and you're just like, I've never done this before. Like, what are you doing? It's no wonder that that people avoid it. They just think it's too hard, and they just go back to what's comfortable on TikTok or whatever the fuck. Um, but it's more like, even some of your intelligent friends, it's uh, that's all there. Like, it's more common than you think.
when a lot of intelligent friends, and I would even risk saying most, are intelligent by the measures of a schooling system that is selecting for a certain kind of person
Right.
to be a certain kind of functionary in a certain kind of corporation. And so, being able to regurgitate facts and find satisfactory answers or problem solve in a speedy way as the measure of intelligence is different than the kinds of comprehension powers that we're talking about here. And
So it's
so
structural that we're working against.
it is absolutely structural. This is not to say anything about any of you who might be listening. And I always just assume that this is about all of us, which is why I think it's probably important for me to start leading with, yeah, I couldn't read until I was 12, and I didn't read any serious nonfiction until I was 23. Let's start with that because, my students, ages 18 through 22 mostly, uh, they come in to the university feeling like they know how to read. And I can tell you from the things that they write that they don't. And not only do they not know how to read, they don't know how to write. And so reading and writing are two of the most important out of three factors of thinking. speech is the third, but that speech is empty without serious reading and writing, you know. And I guess none of this is all very, chauvinist perhaps or whatever, because I'm talking about this like, well, what about Aborigines? Well, yeah, well, Aborigines were literate for the conditions that they lived in. We're not literate for the conditions we live in. That's the point.
Right. Okay. So then why okay, you've talked about the schooling aspect. You've on your big three reasons for why our conditions today are fundamentally different from before and why we're in this post-class fractured mass. You mentioned the medium and yeah, gerrymandering, Befindlichkeit. Can you flesh out those a bit more?
Yeah, and I want to focus first on the medium as still part of an answer to your previous question here. So the two go hand in hand. Okay, so you're saying people used to be a lot less literate and now they're more literate yet, that so like what's the difference here? And I think I want to problematize that uh first by way of Leonard Spencer and something he said across from me at the bar after the convention. And then the other thing is what I referenced in conversation with him there, which is chapter 4 on the typographic mind by in Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. So yeah, this book Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. I'm actually downloading it from Anna's archive right now as we speak because I didn't have it in my documents and I didn't want to have to look at my phone. But I mean, it's a banger. First of all, I think you would really love it. Postman is probably my favorite person influenced by McLuhan, outside of perhaps maybe Baudrillard, but he's an American, which is awesome. I prefer Americans over Frenchies anyway. And he does this thing in the well throughout the book, but especially in the typographic mind, where he's talking about the literacy of our predecessors, especially here in the United States. I guess that you're close enough. I'll say it includes you too. I think everything he's saying here would count for
Mhm.
even Canadians, except who knows? So, but McLuhan was a Canadian, and so that's the real tie-in here. What what he says is that not only was literacy rates higher at the founding of the country than they are today, being something like 97% literacy for women, 98 for men, and we're talking free women and free men. Obviously, we're not talking about indentured servants and slaves. But we're talking about free people. The literacy rates were that high. And what were they reading? They were reading things like the King James Bible, Plato. They were reading Hamilton and Jefferson and Locke and they were also reading Marx because Marx would appear in these op-eds. And Spencer Leonard said that these op-eds, where people were reading Marx, rarely had the names of the authors on them. And so, he's been on this project, Leonard, of finding all of these old public writings by Marx that were, these were in newspapers. And he said that workers were reading these aloud to one another on the shop floors. And I said, that's
Yeah.
great because, I want to do stuff for people who are workers with earbuds, right? Well, that's cool because people get all like, "Oh, I can't listen to books." It's like, well, what do you think those workers were doing? They didn't have earbuds, but when someone's reading it aloud on the shop floor and everyone else is listening to it, it's kind of similar, except that it kind of brings people together a little bit more.
Yeah, that was like the literate workers would read for the illiterate workers.
Yeah, and that's a good point as well because even when I couldn't read, I could still listen to audiobooks, and so I was listening to audiobooks before I learned to read. I mean, audio is my preferred medium when it comes to that kind of thing. Though I'll just say, for people who think that you can have one without the other, you need to be able to pull up the book and then look at the part that you're thinking about when it's stuck in your head like a song after the fact. Like if you're walking around days later thinking about a part of a book, you can go listen to it again, but it's going to benefit you a lot more to actually sit there and look it over and think about it deeply. And so I like that Spencer was on that. I think that shows that he's also thinking about how a certain kind of literacy does need to be worked on, right? So that would be the sort of civil organizing too, perhaps. But the other part about it, we're talking about attention span, about weaving uh, different threads through hours of a train of thought, and then also considering other points of view, counter arguments, whatever. Well, what my favorite example of that Neil Postman gives in chapter 4 of Amusing Ourselves to Death, the typographic mind, is the part where he's talking about the Lincoln Douglas debates. And let's see, can I pull up the typographic mind here? I want to read the first paragraph to you. Let's see if I can do it real quick. He says the first of the 7 famous debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas took place on August 21st, 1858 in Ottawa, Illinois. Their arrangement provided that Douglas would speak first for 1 hour, Lincoln would take an hour and a half to reply, Douglas a half hour to rebut Lincoln's reply. This debate was considerably shorter than those to which the two men were accustomed. In fact, they had tangled several times before, and all of their encounters had been much lengthier and more exhausting. For example, on October 16th, 1854, in Peoria, Illinois, Douglas delivered a 3-hour address to which Lincoln, by agreement, was to respond. When Lincoln's turn came, he reminded the audience that it was already 5 p.m., that he would probably require as much time as Douglas, and that Douglas was still scheduled for a rebuttal. He proposed, therefore, that the audience go home, have dinner, and return refreshed for 4 more hours of talk. The audience amiably agreed, and matters proceeded as Lincoln had outlined. What kind of audience was this? Who were these people who could so cheerfully accommodate themselves to 7 hours of oratory? Yeah, and so I mean, it's a fire book, and especially that chapter, I really love it. But to bring it back to the question though, just so we can remind people where we're at, especially the people who are very like ADHD brained here on the internet, you know. Well, what we're talking about is like what changed, and we're not just saying that literacy changed, because that would, I think a lot of people, when they think about this, they say the schooling system changed, or the expectations within the schooling system changed, or we somehow don't fund schooling the way that we used to, or like they start thinking like progressives, and progressives, the solution to all of the world's problems is just to put more money into the failing schooling system that we currently have, right? And what I will want to talk about is how that schooling system was built. It was built to co-opt a working class demand for universal education, and at the same time preempt any possibility of class consciousness or mass scale organizing. That's what the
Yep.
schooling
Yep.
system.
We both read Weapons of Mass Instruction. Great
Exactly.
book.
And I've got a
Tremendous
couple of
book.
tremendous book. He's a great man. Some people are even saying he might be the greatest writer in the world. I don't know. I mean, I think maybe, probably the best, the greatest mind working. John Taylor Gatto, a good guy. Um, but actually, let me pull up that, because that's such a controversial thing, before we get into the real situation that's changed with the medium, where I'll read a quote from Bernays, our good friend Bernays. Now that you've gotten me thoroughly Adam Curtis pilled, let me read the 2 pivotal quotes here. And actually, I'll have you read the first one here.
As president of Princeton University to the New York City School Teachers Association in 1909, quote, we want one class of persons to have liberal education, and we want another class of persons, very much a larger class, of necessity, in every society to forego the privileges of liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific difficult manual tasks.
Right. And so this is the father of progressivism, of progressive schooling, which is to say public universal schooling. This was his idea. And then let me share the other quote. Now, where did he get he the thing is, as a president, he was the president of Princeton then, he became the president of the United States soon after. Remember, he's the one who had the United States invade Russia in 1918 with the Allies as a way of countering the 1917 revolution. And so
This is Wilson, you mean?
Woodrow Wilson. So this is from, I'm saying that he can't do everything. He's not just a great man of history thing. No, it's a bunch of great men working together. And so Woodrow Wilson was homies with the Rockefellers and Carnegies, who are the richest, most powerful people in that century. And so here we go. He from the Rockefellers General Education Board, occasional letter number one. And remember, this is from John Taylor Gatto's Weapons of Mass Instruction, like we just referenced. This is, I mean, Gatto, for a libertarian, he's very class conscious and he's very aware of like the things that the schooling system did to undermine working class organizing. And so that's why he pulls these quotes. But yeah, here's from the Rockefellers. They said, in our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present educational conventions of intellectual and moral education fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, educators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have an ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is very simple. We will organize children and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way. And there's like an idea of like the rolling revolution, which I get from some professor who taught political theory at Boise State. He got super canceled a bunch of years ago. Dr. Yenner, he talks about the rolling revolution in reference to feminism, but the rolling revolution, the idea of a rolling revolution is where the people at the beginning have a very clear vision of what they want to do. And then they set the whole thing up to do that. But then there's like a dumb version that's being advanced as part of the grander vision. And so it makes it easy for functionaries to get involved, say things that just sound good and show and require no awareness of the bigger vision or goals of the movement or institution. And then what you have is like really well-meaning, in this case, teachers, really well-meaning teachers and parents who are all about this approach to education, but they don't realize that even though they are trying to raise authors, educators, poets, men of letters, scientists from the ranks of the working class, the institution was structured in such a way as to render that impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And to render that kind of class consciousness impossible. And so the school is a medium. And as a medium, it has undermined the conditions of possibility that you would require for civil society or for the party. And so to say what the medium is, like, why does that actually matter? So shout out to Marshall McLuhan, famous for saying the medium is the message. But what is the message? Right? What does that mean to say that the medium is the message or the massage? Which is like a play on words that gets implemented here and will become very relevant when we bring in Baudrillard in a second. The message, and I'm reading Neil Postman here, message here means the perceptions you are allowed to build, the attitudes you are enticed to assume, the sensitivities you are encouraged to develop, almost all of the things you learn to see and feel and value. You learn them because your environment is organized in such a way that it permits or encourages or insists that you learn them. And then skipping a little later, he says, I propose in this and the chapter that follows to suggest the nature of that influence and to begin doing so by comparing television with another and older medium of communication, school. As it is mostly conducted even at the present age, school is one of our few remaining information systems firmly organized around pre-electronic patterns of communication. School is old times and old biases. For that reason, it is more valuable to us than most people realize, but in any case, provides a clear contrast to the newer system of perception and thought that television represents. By putting television and school side by side, we can see where we are going and what we are leaving, which is exactly what we need to know. Now, there's like several other paragraphs I would read in an ideal like 5-hour conversation, but I'll just kind of say, he wants to basically say that 1/3 of your life, the most formative years of your life, before you become the creature of habit that you will become, is 1/3 is spent sleeping. The next third is spent in school. and then the other third is spent on television. Television has been replaced for the most part by streaming and social media platforms, kind of the conjunction of both, so that we are sort of ADHD bouncing back and forth between both forms of entertainment, right? And so, it's Netflix and TikTok would be the short way of saying that. But to say that that's the environment and that it shapes our actual taste and our mode of communication and our inability to follow a long train of thought, like a lot of people, if this was a live stream, probably the people talking the most in the live stream would be incapable of actually following the threads of the long train of thought. It's very difficult, but it's difficult because you're swimming upstream against your actual environment. The environment is nurturing you, but it's nurturing you in a way that's like abusive, that stultifies your actual higher capacities. And so I said simultaneity and asynchronicity are part of the message of that medium. And what that means is like this idea that you have instantaneous access to everyone else,
Mm.
instantaneity, instantaneous access to everyone else on call all the time. And then you yourself are instantaneously on call to everyone else all the time. And that's why notifications become such a bother as soon as you actually want to try to reclaim your attention span, right? And then you have kids in school who want to have their phones on right in front of them. Well, what if my mom calls me? You're a fucking grown ass adult. What are you talking about? What if your mom calls you? Oh, well, I know someone who's sick in a hospital. Oh, wow. How did humans ever survive? Right? But we buy into this idea that because some potential emergency that would probably only happen like once in your life is, imminent, then now you have to be on call for every notification that comes through, which just fractures your ability to follow anything. And so everything is asynchronously, simultaneously available. That's what we're talking about. And then I'll just bring it back to that Baudrillard quote, and then we can sit here and riff on it. All right, because this is the quote. So Baudrillard is like Dark McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan thought the medium, especially television, was creating the conditions for the global village, which is a sort of utopian, kind of I want to say communistic. It's not communist, but it's communistic idea of like we'll all be in on the same thing. Oh, the back of your throat looks really good right now.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for
You sound like my grade three French teacher
for what?
for commenting on whenever I yawned in
I do
class.
it with everybody now. I've started doing it with everybody now. It's like nobody wants to see the back of your throat. Maybe you could start an OnlyFans for it though. I don't know. It's possible, but like some people might want to see the back. But Baudrillard, okay, so he's Dark McLuhan, right? So there's Marshall McLuhan thinks that we'll have this global village, and then Baudrillard's like, actually, it's the opposite. And so he says at the beginning of In the Shadows of the Silent Majorities, he says, the whole chaotic constellation of the social revolves around the spongy referent, that opaque but equally translucent reality, that nothingness, the masses. A statistical crystal ball. The masses are swirling with currents and flows. He quotes that like he's quoting Deleuze or something. In the image of matter and the natural elements, so at least they are represented to us. They can be mesmerized. The social envelops them like static electricity. But most of the time, precisely, they form an earth. That is, they absorb all the electricity of the social and political and neutralize it forever. They
Mm.
are neither good conductors of the political, nor good conductors of the social, nor good conductors of meaning in general. Everything flows through them, everything magnetizes them, but diffuses throughout them without leaving a trace. And ultimately, the appeal to the masses has always gone unanswered. They do not radiate. On the contrary, they absorb all radiation from the outlying constellations of state, history, culture, meaning. They are inertia, the strength of inertia, the strength of the neutral. In this seam, the mass is characteristic of our modernity as a highly implosive phenomenon, irreducible for any traditional theory and practice, even perhaps for any theory and practice at all. And so he's saying that like, oh, perhaps, but anybody who knows about later Baudrillard, he becomes super black pilled about the possibilities of doing anything. When he's younger, he's got some dumb new left ideas like, oh, graffiti's radical, actually. But at some point, he's like, oh, there's just nothing we can do. And that's not my position. That's not the position of most people at Theory Underground either. And I know it's not your position or anyone at Platypus. Like, we all think something can be done and that we have to be trying to do things. But I'm saying, just to wrap it up here, that anything that we do, if it's to be meaningful or adequately respond to the situation, is going to really have to sit with the fact that like, we're more like how Marx described peasants than we are like how, in that Lenin quote earlier, Lenin was describing the proletariat, right? Because he says we're being welded together, the proletariat. But Marx says that the peasantry is like a class. And then he says, well, it's like a class and it's not like a class, right? Do you remember this quote from the 18th Brumaire? It's a really good.
I no, but I mean I read it a few months ago, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So this is like, to me, I think because I was already thinking along these lines, I was like, oh my gosh, he said it right here. Because there's this whole thing back when I used to really talk about the PMC a lot.
mhm.
To say PMC creates all these problems with people who think a lot about class, because it can throw a wrench into how they're thinking about class, or they'll say that it's just not a class by the definitions that they like to use. And so, of course, I've been thinking a lot about that. And Elton LK from the Working Class Intelligentsia, who you should definitely have on here at some point. He's an amazing guy. Um, he wrote a piece called Marx. I think it's called like Marx was confused about class or something like that. And like the whole piece is like Marx constantly vacillates between three definitions of class. He's like saying this and then he's like that. And then he's like, this is a great example of it, right? This is a great example of it right here. So from the 18th Brumaire, Marx is saying that the peasantry is and is not a class. So he says the small holding peasants form an enormous mass whose members live in similar conditions, but without entering into manifold relations with each other. Their mode of production isolates them from one another instead of bringing them into mutual intercourse. Skipping below. Thus, the great mass of the French nation is formed by the simple addition of homologous magnitudes, much as potatoes in a sack form a sack of potatoes. So what matters? Why
Sack of
is it that
potatoes. There it is.
here we go? Yeah, exactly. Why does that matter though, Swole? Like why does he feel the need to say this about the peasantry, right?
Well, because he thinks that they can't in themselves lead the revolution. They're not situated to because of their conditions. They're not in a position to. They might be part of it, but they're not going to be the ones that lead it.
Exactly. Yeah. It matters because we're trying to think about, as theorists and organizers, where to direct our time and our energy in the form of effort. Should we be directing it towards um, a side of the working class? Because peasants are workers too, right? Should we be directing our efforts towards an arm of the working class that is fundamentally unorganizable, at least for the kind of change that we're thinking about? And I mean, they're saying no, like you're going to burn out, like it'd be a huge waste of time. You see these proletarians over here, they're being concentrated in mass. They've got these advanced workers who don't need bosses or managers. They've got military style discipline, and their hands are on the actual levers that make the world go round. And when they step back in unison, as they are already doing without our help, whenever they strike and form labor unions, the world grinds to a halt. And then people are, the bourgeoisie is forced to make concessions to them. So it's like they're obviously the more progressive or organizable, revolutionary subject or arm of that working class.
I think what a platypus member would say was that it's both. They would say that capitalism is still pushing people as Lenin said into this formation of radicalizing and organizing, while at the same time maybe they might agree with you that there's a tendency in the other way to atomize and isolate and alienate workers from each other in the post-class fractured mass, which might mean that we are tasked with taking up these things that you talk about. So then my question would be, what does the progressive schooling, the medium, gerrymandering, Befindlichkeit, what do these task you, Dave, and Theory Underground with?
They task me with thinking we need to, as I said at the beginning, um, do this more radical sort of clearing away of presuppositions and categories, not in a way that says willy nilly, we don't need to read history, we don't need to read old theory, we don't need to use concepts like proletariat. No, obviously, I'm reading these things and I care about these categories and these concepts, but we do have to take a lot more seriously, like what's different and are these categories uh, useful in the ways that they were, right? So would it be worth our time, our energy, our effort to try to organize uh, civil society so as to produce a kind of revolutionary subject that no longer exists? Would Marx have done that? No. Marx was like looking out the window, so to speak, and he was like, "Oh, look, it's right there."
Mhm.
And now we've got people who are like looking out the window and they're like, "It's not there. We must change society so that it's there again." And I'm like, "Well, what if it's something else now?" Right? Now, in the manifesto of the Communist Party, our favorite people in the world, Marx and Engels, what did they say? They said the proletariat alone is the really revolutionary class and that the other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. And then he sits there and talks about elements of the working class, like the small manufacturer, shopkeeper, artisan, and peasant. And he said that they fight against the bourgeoisie, but to save themselves from extinction, right? And so
Mhm.
he says that
Yeah.
they are for that reason reactionary because they try to roll back the wheel of history. Well, if you're looking out the window and the proletariat's not the revolutionary subject anymore, and you're like, oh, we must rebuild the conditions that would make it the revolutionary subject, would that not be trying to roll back the wheel of history? And then wouldn't it be, by Marx and Engels' own terms, reactionary? This is why in my conversation with Doug and Benjamin a couple days ago, going up on my channel here in a couple days, I said, look, Doug, I'm going to say it. It's not me saying it. I think Marx and Engels would say it. They would say that you are reactionary and counter revolutionary for trying to bootstrap into existence a dictatorship of the proletariat when it's not the situation anymore.
Let me devil's advocate here for you a little bit.
Please, please.
It's not conditions they're trying to change because we're still in capitalism. They're not trying to go pre-industrial capitalism, which is what maybe the petty bourgeois or the artisans are kind of after. Whereas we're still in capitalism. There's still society based on surplus value extracted from the workers. And so it's just about reconstituting the class itself, which exists kind of technically in germ form, but the form of society hasn't really changed, they would say.
You agree with this?
I think it's plausible. I don't know. I don't know that it's the answer, but it's a plausible.
It's it's a plausible platypus.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right.
Yeah. I'm not against that idea, but it seems to me like the plausibility it's possible. Possible and plausible are two different things though, right? Like it's also possible that you could end up being president of the United States even though you were never an American citizen. Like it's possible, things could change.
Yeah.
But it's not very plausible,
Mhm.
right? There for a lot of reasons. And so like I think our ability to do like a modal calculus where we can really weigh uh, possibility versus plausibility. Um, it's it's itself like one of the more difficult tasks, right? Like that kind of a modal calculation. I don't think like Bayesian logic or something like that gets us there. You know, I don't think that modal symbolic like kinds of like logic get us there. Like we need new approaches theoretically that have to be grounded in the old ones but also the new situation,
Where does
right?
time energy fit into potentially new approaches?
Well, I mean, we have to be realists first about the fact that nobody has any, not really, to speak of. So we're
Is it
talking
something we
largely,
organize around?
right? So we'd have to get the kinds of institutions that could get us the time, energy, the tutelage to be able to discover and cultivate the kinds of talents necessary to even be able to do what Marx did in the British Museum when he was writing Das Kapital, right? Like he was in dialogue with the greatest minds, and he was assessing the current situation. And so we would have to do, I mean, we are kind of trying to do that, aren't we? But I think for me, though, the main thing is to counter this sort of sense that everything has to be right now and instantaneous, and that doesn't mean like slow growth or giving, but it does mean some kind of giving ourselves time.
Mhm.
And so the piece that I was working on this morning, actually, it's called, like, I think it's something like on the Zoomer question, and it's uh, because I don't think that as millennials are, or at least my direct task is to work with Zoomers in particular. Like that's somebody else's kids. That's not even like my kids' generation, right? Like I have a and millennials aren't my peers. They're not my peer group, right? My peer group are the parents of uh, the generation of children that I will be a parent of. Like that's my peer group. So back when I wrote Waypoint, I said I'm preparing myself to write to the parents of the kids who will be 25 and 30 years. And so that was a way of buying myself some more time since I felt like this tremendous pressure. Everyone's always like, "Well, what is to be done then?" And it's like, "Well, Marx gave himself like 15 years, I'm pretty sure. I'm giving myself 5 years to develop a sort of strategy with people who I consider to be my peers, which, like I said, aren't millennials. It might include millennials. It might, because you're probably going to have kids, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I think we'll.
we got one in August coming.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, congratulations. Yeah, I think that we'll be peers in the sense that I'm talking, but also so with some Zoomers, right? Because they'll also be having children around that time,
Mhm.
and so uh, there's a way of breaking from this, like, oh, I'm a millennial. Now I have to talk to the next generation. I have to talk to the Zoomers. I have to radicalize the Zoomers. Like there was this lady after the Platypus convention at the bar or whatever. She was like trying to get me to beef with somebody who had been on a panel. Um, she wanted me to name his name because I said, yeah, one of those guys really sounded like ChatGPT. And she's like, who? And she kept trying to get me to say who. And I was like, no, no, I'm tired and I have to think about it some more. And I kind of feel bad for him. And she's like, if you don't, she's like, why are people so afraid of disagreeing? If you don't disagree with him, then the Zoomers will go to him. And I was like, what I should have said is just like, look, if the Zoomers are dumb enough to go to this guy, then they'll eventually burn out and realize that they were stupid, and then they'll look for someone else, right? And then they can come to us. But you don't try to catch them when they're that dumb and susceptible.
Mhm.
But the thing I focused on was like Zoomers are not my target demographic. That's not my audience. So I guess I'm talking about a sort of strategy for creating sort of a certain kind of educational space and a sort of attitude towards myself, the future, and a kind of peer group, so as to lay the conditions for the kind of milieu that could even do the kind of theory that could organize within the post class fractured mass or the potato class fractured mass.
So for you, it's like you're looking at it. The pre-political is reconstituting theory, reconstituting um, a a portion of society that's looking to get beyond capitalism, having the ability to the preconditions to do so, in order that we can think our way out of it, and to kind of, I guess, redo what Marx did, but in a different way under transformed conditions.
Yeah, 100%.
So you're looking at the problem from a different angle that the Campaign for Socialist Party is doing it. They say we need the civil society institutions with the workers. They're not concerned with theory or even political theory really at all. That's something you keep in your back pocket, as Catrone says.
Yeah, and I hope that I'm wrong and that they solve the problems without me. That I'll be over here like a like a crank who doesn't care about talking to Zoomers or whatever, and
Mhm.
then they'll fucking make the magic happen, and then I'll be like, ah, damn it, they were right. But I'm gonna I'm gonna proceed as though that's not true because my hunch is um I need to do what I'm doing, right? And I want to, on that note, say because you brought up gerrymandering Befindlichkeit, and I want to thank you for that. Like usually people hear me say that, and they hear me say, I don't know, like usually the questions don't really go in that direction, right? And so let's just say a couple things about it, but let's start with like, I guess you followed my thinking and my work, or at least you've been kind of a you've been a fellow traveler,
Yeah, you
you
called it
know.
something different before. You called it psychological. No, what did you call it? Something gerrymandering.
Yeah, I've moved between ideological and psychological, and now Befindlichkeit, right?
Yeah.
So, and gerrymandering is a sort of it's a metaphor, of course, or an analogy, and so it's problematic, and we can dig into the ways that it's similar and different. But off the top of your head, based off of where I used to be, like how did you think about how I was using that term? And then I'll say how it's kind of updated. Yeah.
That the ways we're even able to think have been already kind of boxed in by society. We're basically put in a couple like boxes and not able to communicate or like think outside of it in a dynamic way.
Yeah, that's really good. But I want to use some like concrete examples so it'll be a little less abstract for folks. First, I'll say like if you followed the work of Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind or George Lakoff in what is it called, like Moral Politics or Don't Think of an Elephant or any of those kinds of works, um, what you get at is like, oh, well, there's like fundamentally different psychological neurological configurations that then privilege certain kinds of moral frameworks or
Right,
at
right, right. If you're a caring type person or a more liberal-minded type person or you're a more safety security type person, you're going to be gerrymandered. You're going to be funneled into a certain type of box thinking. Yeah, then they're kind of oppositional and there's no crossover.
yeah, in the same way that like the high school makes you have to choose an identity between uh being more artsy or sportsy. When
Yeah.
in reality, like think of like the ancient Greeks. Did they have to choose between arts and sports? No. The system that we currently live in makes kids have to choose. And then like your authenticity is like whether you hold to that for the rest of your life. Oh yeah, well I'm just more of a left brain person. Oh yeah, I'm just more of like a sports person. And it's like don't you mean you're a broken person? Like whole humans do athletic and artistic activities, right? And in the same way, a whole kind of person doesn't make a choice on compassion and open-mindedness versus security for immediate loved ones. But that is the sort of difference in disposition that we're talking about between left and right. In the American culture war sense, like one side is much more fit to people who are all about being open-minded, open to new experiences, all about nurture and compassion and thinking about environment, which is all kind of feminine coded, of course,
Yeah.
versus like strength and bootstraps and security and looking out for your immediate loved ones and taking responsibility. And it's like those are all just factors of living a whole human life, but the current game is rigged to make people feel like they're forced to take a position. And we can all think of like Democrats who are super conservative and Republicans who are super liberal. So there are exceptions that I would say prove the rule, but that's not even, I mean, okay, every time that there's a sort of bifurcation of the human, and you have to choose a side, within the side that you choose, there's another bifurcation that you can take a side on. And so it's like, are you a conservative conservative or are you a liberal conservative? At the point that you've chosen liberal versus conservative, or the society has, like Harry Potter's sorting hat, chosen for you your house.
Hmm.
Within that, now you have to differentiate yourself from your group. And so you do that by being the hyper version of it that is like the sort of stereotype on steroids, or you do it with like you're like, yeah, I'm
You're the
conservative, but
moderate.
I'm a little bit more moderate. I'm a little bit more open minded. Yeah, and so Lakoff will say that it's like these metaphors that we live by, these frameworks are like the most powerful things for us. And so almost all of the debates in contemporary politics are framed in a way that is meant to cater to one of the two, and he focuses on two sort of metaphors. On the liberal side, it's the idea of a more motherly, nurturant, egalitarian family, versus on the other side, it's a much more like dad runs the house, he knows what's best. We need to help him. We need to take our orders from him. You know, so these are examples, but the reason I go to Befindlichkeit instead of psychology or ideology like I used to is because those things are downstream ultimately from what made me care about Lakoff in the first place, which it's my reading of Being in Time. And so Befindlichkeit is one of the three most important existentials that Heidegger develops throughout Division One of Being in Time, and that's where he's developing the concept of being in the world, which is supposed to start where we're at, and it's what you have to presuppose in order to get to any of the things that we actually experience. And Befindlichkeit is basically like this word attunement, except it's a little bit more complicated.
Mm.
So attunement, you can think of like Plato in the way that you can be attuned to this as opposed to that. But Befindlichkeit gets to the fact that we are the kind of creature who is always already attuned. And that you can think of like a fundamental attunement in the world, like conservative or progressive might be a fundamental attunement. But then you can also think of like moods as like derivative attunements. And so whether you're angry that day or you're just, super positive and energized that day, those are attunements as well. But they're like a more secondary kind of attunement. Your fundamental attunement is your base predisposition,
Mm.
right? And of course, like that can change because you had some crazy event in your life or something like that.
What would, Lacanians have to say about the idea of base disposition? Can that even really be said, or is it learned?
Yeah, it's a nature versus nurture question, right? And nature versus nurture is like a really simplistic heuristic we can use, but Lacanians are going to be a lot more sophisticated in how they go about it. And I think the way that I could have a conversation with a Lacanian, if I wanted to talk to them about this, would just be to say, okay, we're talking about how in a situation where you have to compete and defensively differentiate yourself from your artificial peer group in an environment that you're forced to be in for a third of your life, whether it's school or the workplace, um, your own intelligibility to yourself or others is going to be based on a sort of libidinal uh, desire drive sort of uh, series or circuit of cathexes that we make for and against various things, and that a lot of this is unconscious. But I'd want to instantly skip out ahead of the psychoanalytic question and go to the socioanalytic question and bring in Bourdieu and say, what we're talking about is like, what are the coping strategies that you develop consciously and unconsciously as you navigate fields, between fields and in fields? And every field is defined as a place where there is respect, honor, and even prestige that can be won or lost. And in the schooling system, we're talking about your entire future is hanging over your head. And they use that as a carrot and a stick to ritually rank and haze you and or your peers, right? I mean, if you're naturally disposed to be really good at school, at pleasing teachers and also being cool with peers, like it's not even going to stand out as a thing. But if you realize like you're the butt of every joke, or the teachers kind of use you as an example of what not to be like, and they're like, and the subtext, and sometimes they'll just come out and straight up say it. is if you're like so and so, well, you're not going to be more than a dump truck driver. Like you're going to have a
Yeah.
shitty job. Like that's literally being used on you for a third of your life.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
So what does that mean? What does understanding this gerrymandering Befindlichkeit mean for and or task us with for uh large scale the horizon of large scale structural change? Like what do we have to tarry with here?
I don't understand the full implications of it myself, but I mean because it's it's in development, right? This is research in development, right? I mean the book would already be out there if I felt like I was ready to advance the thesis in a more thoroughly fleshed out way. At this point, I'm more interested in having serious conversations with fellow travelers like you so that it can stir the pot and that'll motivate me to go deeper into certain areas of the fields that are relevant to this, right? So, for instance, people having big critiques of Lakoff and Haight would be fantastic, right? Like that, like Christine Louise Solly critiques it in her Transcending Racial Divisions, this kind of psychologizing political differences.
Right.
It psychologizes and then naturalizes political differences that are not psychological or ideological, but that are fundamentally real. Like she'll say, like this is the difference between treating people like they're people and equal, as opposed to reinforcing natural hierarchies and that kind of thing. And I think that that's something that I have to tarry with, but I don't think it's enough to really undermine the broader point here, because I do think when we're talking about people who've been radicalized in the last 10 years that are friends and family, and they're just normies, they're not into theory, they're
Mhm.
just like radicalized because they think they're part of the resistance against Trump
Everybody
or
thinks they're
because,
part of some resistance now. That's the thing. You're either part of the right wing resistance or you're now part of the liberal progressive resistance. Everybody's been
right,
shoot been roped into this when most of these people had gave, were not paying attention to any of the shit in the Bush or the Clinton years.
right. Or if they were, it was still this kind of like, okay, you know, Bush is not my president, and oh, Al Gore should have won. Oh, the election was stolen from Al Gore. Remember, like they were all acting like when Trump was saying that the election was rigged or stolen, that was the first time anyone's ever said that, and I was like, gaslighting much? We all remember when Democrats were saying that about Al Gore. Come on, like, do you remember that? Like everyone was saying that it got stolen from Al Gore.
I'll put myself out there, and I still think it was stolen from Al Gore. I think that the Diebold machines in Florida were hacked, in fact, and that enough votes weren't counted that should have been counted that he would have gone over the line. But that doesn't matter.
Well, and I'm open to that. I never really tried to get to the bottom of it, to be fair. I just remember I was like, this isn't the first time, guys.
Hmm.
Uh, but no, they're not based in the critique of political economy. They don't even have critical media theory. They're just normies who watch a lot of news and they're upset because the news is very shrill and telling them the sky is falling, and maybe it is, right? So so is this so? What are we talking about? Are we talking about like what to do about this? Are we talking about what are the implications of gerrymandering Befindlichkeit? What I'm trying to say is that these people would have uh, been conservative or progressive in any society. Like, okay, and if it's not these people, that any society that forces people to kind of make these kind of identity based decisions in these kinds of fields that sort people out the way that they do, there's going to be statistically reliable demographics that get kind of sucked into these sort of dispositions and ideologies, and that uh, progressive and conservative modes of attunement. Now, I do think there's a lot of other modes of attunement we can get into as well that are also part of the way that people get bifurcated at the level of like niche identities, and part of it can even be stuff like free will versus determinism or utilitarianism versus deontology, or there's just sort of dispositions that make people privilege certain kinds of takes on the world.
Right.
And what I'm saying is like uh you might find someone's views backwards or reprehensible, but uh, they were they are susceptible to this as opposed to whatever it is you were susceptible to, and your disposition making you more susceptible to your approach doesn't mean that you're necessarily better or that they're necessarily worse. And it
Right.
was realizing this back in 2020 when I started to just really realize people scapegoating people like my parents because they're conservative when they're really just sweet people. They're just sweet people who are kind of radicalized by the media, but not in
They're
any
good people. Conservatives, they're good people.
not in general. I'm not going to say conservative. People like my parents are good people. People like Anne's parents, they're good people. And so the two sides of my family, they're really good people. I love them very much. We're talking about progressives and we're talking about conservatives, and they can all eat tacos together and hang out and have a great conversation. They're just avoiding the elephant in the room.
So what do we
And
make of the people who are preconditioned to lean one way, whether it's conservative or progressive liberal? What happens when, they'll often flip once the cracks in their own world, their own mode start to seep through, then they go the other way. Actually, there's a lot of people that flip-flop all over the place.
which is itself, I think, a disposition, but also it's ideologically encouraged because whereas some people take it to instantly be a big red flag for, as, oh, look, it's a hypocrite, it's an opportunist, they changed. It's very easy for someone to interpret that those changes the opposite way, which is, oh, look, they learn, they grow. And so, this there are rewards
Yeah.
within this sort of sorting hat system for learning and growing and changing. Nice, nice. So I guess the main thing is like to not assume that there are better and worse people on the basis of attunements itself, and to realize that like the human family, if we're talking about like a pluralistic kind of future, it really does include all these different kinds of attunements, and that real whole humans have all these capacities, and that there's a weird sort of reification of where you're at a certain age. And now you have to make a stand on that identity for the rest of your life and make that who you are. And realizing for ourselves that that's not true, realizing for the people that we organize with that that's not true. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at. That's
I
why
have
people will say it's like a red brown alliance thing, right? People will say it's like a red brown alliance thing because I'm talking about like left and right kinds of people working together. And I'll just say up front, it's not to me really what most people have in mind when they say Red Brown Alliance, because I actually think, as much as there might be very fine people on all sides in every situation, every time, always, whenever we talk about people in the abstract, um, I definitely don't think that anything is won or that it's productive to try to cater to or center extremists, right? Like extremists who just come off to everyone as like repulsive or as completely like removed from the situation. And when we're talking about like a red brown alliance, as far as I can tell, like that is kind of what it comes off like, you know.
you brought up a Lenin quote.
The welding together,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, the welding together. But I was just reminded of something Doug said that harkens back to another Lenin quote about the ascent and descent of the movement for socialism. I just popped it up here. He uses the metaphor of ascending and descending a mountain to illustrate the complexities of revolutionary and political change. In the text, Lenin compares the initial ascent of a revolution or political movement to the climbing of a steep mountain, encouraging difficulties encountering difficulties and dangers along the way. He then describes the descent as potentially more difficult and perilous than the ascent, representing the challenges of consolidating power and navigating the aftermath of change. So he's saying that, like, yeah, you might ascend the mountain and find that the way you went up, the way you climbed is a dead end. And so what you have to do is come back down, and you may have to go all the way back to the beginning. And so what I was pulling from Doug was that he was saying, actually, yeah, our job is not to start at the end. Our job is to start back at the beginning, because every path we've tried up the mountain has failed. Instead of a self-active working class, we have workers operating independently of themselves, workers who are not only alienated from the product of their labor, but who are also alienated from one another politically and socially, which to me sounds similar to the post class, the idea of the post class fractured mask. The task, then, he says, is not to start at the end to find a new totalizing mechanism from within the political order, but rather to help reconnect working people socially and then politically. So, yeah, the social part comes first, the civil society comes first. I mean, I'm kind of just restating what I said at the beginning.
What is the bottom, I guess, would be, I think our idea of what the bottom is, like where is the base camp to that mountain, which base camp, there could be many base camps, many kind of positions that we can set up an encampment, and the question is are we even in the same base camp, right? If Doug's going to keep saying, well, at the end of the day, it is for the sake of organizing the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's like, well, that is putting the cart before the horse from where I'm standing. Now, does that mean that we're in different encampments? Does that mean that we're in, you know what I mean? Is this different base camps? We all agree that there's been a descent, I think. Of course, some people are out there like the lone revolutionary still fighting in the jungle, 50 years after the war is over, So
Yeah.
uh, I would say Doug's not that guy, but I am wondering about if it's even the same base camp. I think we have to we're further down in a sort of sense, but also the PCFM thesis opens a lot of possibilities, right? A lot of the kinds of organizing that would be called by an orthodox Marxist Bonapartist, for instance, might actually not be, or at least might not be. Uh, it might like these analogies just might not work anymore. Like that should be a big part of the point.
What's an
And
example of a Bonapartist or type of organizing? I'm not sure what you mean there.
I mean, I'm kind of thinking about populism, right?
Right.
Like
Okay.
some kind of populism. So might actually be based though, I don't know. I'm open to that.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people just go, oh, well, see, it's not organizing the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's not saying working class, working class, working class, and it still works with some big business people. Oh, well, that's more like a popular front as opposed to a united front, and it's also Bonapartist, and so it's actually counter-revolutionary, and so it's a complete dead end. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, if we were in the 1800s, but like we don't know. Like, there's not the kind of society that existed at the time of the 18th Brumaire. So like the analogies, I don't know. I don't know. I feel like they might lose some footing.
So, what thought would you leave the Marxists, the left, with regarding what Theory Underground's doing and the post-class fractured mass?
I think the thing that's hardest to talk about with Marxists is the medium, and then what the schooling system, what kind of effect it actually has, and the schooling system as a medium. And so it's like I say it's hardest to talk about. But also time energy is, the PCFM is. I guess for me, the reason these things are all hard to talk with Marxists about is like, well, the reason that I would prefer to talk to Marxists most of the time over almost anyone else is because they're more committed to large scale structural change. And I like that. But and also of course, like I just owe this huge debt to Marx. But then I guess the issue that I run into, I think I can blame on people try to sublate too quickly.
Yeah, you said this before. Sublate your project and what you were saying into their own thing.
Yeah, without actually tarrying with it and letting it kind of settle in. So it's like, well, could you try to sit with it? Like, if you want to argue with it, could you sit with it for like, I don't know, maybe even a couple weeks? Just actually sit with it and really think through how much of a problem it might be. And instead of being like, oh, well, it's not a problem because of this, try to challenge yourself again by being like, well, okay, but what if that for some reason isn't a reason that it's not a problem, right? Like, try to throw a wrench in your own position, okay, what I take, so dialectics, one of the most important parts of it, I think, is tarrying with the negative. And you want to flesh through those contradictions, not for the sake of synthesis, though there will always be some kind of an aspect of synthesis that's occurring, but also just because the subject matter and or movement of process, it is constituted through those contradictions. Yeah, but not all contradictions are contradictions. Some are just like superficial antagonisms. And to I think like a genuine kind of sublation, either at the idea of understanding a subject matter or at the idea or at the level of organizing on the planet amongst humans, requires a phenomenological bracketing procedure, right? And so, thanks to Lukács and Adorno, they don't tend to take phenomenology very seriously and think of it as a sort of romanticist sort of thing. And I don't think that's really fair. You know, they just have scathing critiques of Husserl and Heidegger, and I, I, I think they constantly try to force them back into doing something that they're not doing. And this would be a follow up conversation, so maybe we can talk about this some other time. But let me just say what I mean. So bracketing means if you have a sort of natural disposition or attitude that you take towards the world, uh, bracketing means assume it's wrong and then try to see what you can see assuming that it's wrong. And this is more of a this is like this is a methodological approach to thinking through things in a way that's not to get outside of yourself, because you'll never get outside of yourself, but it's meant to kind of counter your natural habits, in terms of thinking. Yeah. And I think that that's like bracketing might be part of a solution for not sublating too quickly, because I do want people to be able to sublate everything ultimately. Uh, but in order to do it, you genuinely have to tarry with it. I said, tarry with it for a couple of weeks, right? Like, I've had so many Marxists say, "Oh, time energy is just labor time," or "Time energy is just labor power," or "Time energy is just this or that." "Oh, that's just odium." "Oh, that's just skole." And it's like, well, how about you think about it for a couple of weeks before you come back at me like my entire like last 10 years spent developing this theory is so easily refuted by something that came into your mind 10 seconds after you heard me say something about it, right? Like, that's a Marxist problem. It's not a problem that I receive from anyone else. It's just Marxists. Oh, Hegelians also do it, but that basically people who consider themselves dialecticians seem to be the quickest to try to downplay, reduce, and dismiss via sublation um, anything new. And so I'm just saying, like, I'm not saying that's all Marxists. I'm not saying that's all Hegelians, but it's like that kind of reaction comes primarily from people who think they're doing dialectics.
Ease off the sublating, bracket, and Terry.
Nailed it,
All right. I think that's all we need. Good.
everybody. Thanks, Swole.
Thanks for coming, Dave.